Thanks so much, Miriam. That was great. My name is Reed Albergotti. I am a reporter with The Information. We're an online publication focused mainly on the tech industry. I'm going to do some intros here just so you get a sense of who we're talking to on the panel. So Miriam Rivera, who you just heard from, co-founder and managing director of Inventors. She joined Google in 2001, where as vice president and deputy general counsel, she helped build the company's legal department. She also helped the company grow from 85 million in revenue to 10 billion in revenue in 5 years. And that's quite a legal department. She won a scholarship to Stanford University, becoming a first-generation college student and earning a law degree. And before Google, she worked at startups like Ariba and Outcome Software. In addition to her work funding the next generation of diverse tech startups, she works for the Stanford Rock Center for Corporate Governance and the Stanford Law School Venture Fund, which, of course, Stanford Law School has a venture fund. I should also mention that she loves Peloton spin classes, which is the most high-tech way to work out. Clint Korver, also co-founder of Ulu with Miriam, is an expert in decision-making. And he actually founded companies called The Decision Company and Decision Street and Decision Quality International. And those companies had a lot of big-name clients. And in addition to making good decisions under uncertainty, he also co-authored a book on ethical decision-making called Ethics in the Real World. And when he's not making great investment decisions, Clint helps budding entrepreneurs at Stanford's Startup Accelerator, and he co-founded an alumni group called Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs. And Aline Lerner, sitting next to me, is an MIT graduate and an engineer by trade, so naturally she spent a few years as a cook after college, and then eventually became a recruiter working for companies like Udacity and starting her own firm. In 2015, she co-founded Interviewing.io, which helps job candidates with free anonymous technical interview practice. And she uses the data to help identify top performers. Now, because this service allows people to take practice interviews anonymously, it takes the bias out of the equation in interview. And Interviewing.io has sent diverse candidates to companies like Facebook, Quora, Jane Street, Uber, Twitch, and Lyft. I've heard of some of those. And I should mention that Ulu actually funded her company. So I want to start out with a question for you, Miriam. So The Information a few years ago started this list, and we wanted to see how diverse the venture capital industry was. So we just went out and looked at all the pictures and bios of all of the general partners, the decision makers at these firms. And the numbers were really not good. They've gotten a little bit better. So of 624 total decision makers, there are 91 women. This is 73 venture capital firms. 10 black, 14 Hispanic. I mean, it's gotten a little better, but we're talking about very small numbers here. But the reason that we did this was, you laid out a very complicated, intricate decision-making process. Ours was much simpler. Ours was, if there's diversity at VC firms, then those firms they'll invest in more diverse companies because they won't have that same bias that the predominantly white male general partners have. And then we think they'll be more successful because they'll see companies that are sort of outside the box. They'll find those diamond in the rough companies. And I'm just wondering if you agree with that premise. Do you think by this combination of trying to remove bias from your decision-making process and also just thinking about diversity, that you're finding companies that other people don't necessarily see?
I do think that we see things that people don't see, but it comes from a variety of reasons. One of which is our own diversity and our own investment in our networks is paying off. So when I did the JD MBA at Stanford, I was involved in all the traditional sort of clubs that we all were. But I also was always involved in a club for women, a club for Latinos, and a club for minorities. And so I built up different networks that helped me to access alums from that community that may be broader than others. I saw that work at Google, where I helped create one of the most diverse legal departments in the United States, with 50% women and about a third of the people being minority, which was in excess of the kind of traditional numbers in those fields. That was also voted one of the best legal departments in the United States, and some of those people have gone on to become the first deputy CTOs of the United States, two of those, the CEO of the Huffington Post, the first general counsel of Pinterest, Dropbox, and Twitter. And I think accessing that kind of talent is possible because of the depth of investment in networks earlier.
And Clint, what do you think about that question? I mean, your whole career has been basically trying to figure out ways to take the biases that we all have. Do you agree with our premise, or, you know?
Well, I guess what I'd say is, on? Hello? All right. So one of the things I would say is that venture actually has a really inherent problem with this notion that there are some people that just have the magic and other people that don't. And so when you have this notion of, and by the way, it's called pattern matching and these sorts of things. Well, from my point of view, pattern matching could just as easily be cognitive bias. And how would you know the difference? How would you know the difference between a great pattern that's going to help you see insights and make great investments versus a cognitive bias that's actually going to limit your opportunities and actually limit the opportunities of other folks? And in this industry, we have such a small amount of data, and the data that we do have doesn't really get used in a very effective way. So I would say that it's a good start to have more women in GP roles. I mean, you certainly need that. But I would say there's other things that you need to add to this as well for the industry to learn about what's effective in the decision-making cycle. And it requires data, and it requires more reflection, I would argue.
And I just want to, I want to learn a little bit more about interviewing, Aline. I mean, eventually, you're taking this anonymous interview, but eventually you have to get in front of people, right? And you have to reveal who you really are. So can you explain the process? Like, how does it work? Like, how do you actually take the bias out of the hiring process?
I'd love to. Great, this works. So hiring is a funnel. And by definition, the top of the funnel is the biggest part of it, right? So that means that most mistakes are also going to be made at the top of the funnel. Typically, when a company is deciding whether they want to talk to a candidate, they're going to look at their resume, and they'll probably look at a few signals, whether they admit it or not. Those are going to be where somebody went to school and where they've worked before. And then, because you have to make decisions quickly because everyone's busy, that's going to be that. So certainly, if a candidate does well through the process and they get on site, short of wearing a paper bag on their head, you're going to know who they are. But by that point, I think you've mitigated a lot of the bias that you'd be encountering otherwise. In our experience, the biggest barriers to people getting into top companies, very, very good engineers, are where they went to school and where they've gone on paper. And what ends up happening is recruiters chase the same 10 fairly homogenous candidates. Of course, I went to MIT, so I can't be, too judgy about it. But it's people that went to MIT and Stanford and schools like that. And I've worked at Google and Facebook. But the talent shortage is a real thing. Demand for software engineers is growing, but credentialing is not really keeping up. So it's cool. I mean, for our customers, this is a pretty awesome arbitrage opportunity while it lasts.
So is there a pipeline problem, like a lot of these companies like to say?
I believe that certainly there is a pipeline problem. I think that one of the things we don't talk about, though, is conscious versus unconscious bias, right? Certainly there's unconscious bias against women and other underrepresented groups in tech, but there's a very conscious bias in many cases against engineers who did not go to top schools. I think enrollment in top universities is growing linearly in computer science, but not very sharp, whereas enrollment in MOOCs like Udacity, where I used to run hiring, and Coursera are growing exponentially as are boot camps. It's not to say that all those candidates are great, but it does mean credentialing is going to look really different in 5 years, whether we like it or not. And last thing I'll say is on our platform, we try to compare. So we have all this interview data. We know how people do both in practice interviews and in company interviews because companies anonymously interview candidates on our platform as well. And the number one signal for whether somebody would do well in a technical interview, and of course, correlation, causation, I don't know, right? But it was not where they went to school. That didn't really matter. It was whether they had taken hardcore algorithms classes on MOOCs like Udacity and Coursera.
Aline, is there a pipeline problem? Do you agree? I mean, I'm sorry, Miriam. I want to ask Miriam because
I think there's a difference between pipeline issues in corporate versus venture, right? If you think about the number of people that are being hired into corporate America, the volume of jobs is very large. And so there may be a shortage of people, especially if we are still basing those decisions on whether they went to Stanford or Harvard or MIT versus whether or not they've actually done courses like on Coursera. So that's going to have a big impact. But in terms of venture capital, I mean, I think the reality is that 72% of the VCs do not have technical degrees. More than half of them have never been an entrepreneur. More than half of them have never been in a tech company and have not been a senior executive in a tech company. But when we want to invite diverse people to come in, they must have all those qualifications. And that is really part of the barrier. It's that we change the criteria depending on who it's being applied to.
So a lot of these companies, you guys have sort of tried to figure out a way to make a decision-making process that takes, the sort of the human element out of it in a way. But a lot of these companies do that. I mean, Google is sort of famous. There's been books written about this. They figured out this very complex way of finding job candidates without allowing, emotion to come into play. But they still don't do well on diversity. So why is that exactly? Clint, why don't you answer this, if you can?
Why doesn't Google do well on diversity?
Their diversity numbers haven't. I mean, it's still about, on the technical staff, it's still about 20% female, and it hasn't really gone up in any significant way. So they've actually tried to do this. What's wrong with their decision-making process?
You'd have to ask somebody over at Google on that. Maybe Miriam knows.
Well, I would say that the percentage is more reflective of what the graduation rates are in that field. So one is, what are we basing what the diversity number should be versus a bigger societal number? Yeah, women are half of all the people, but they're not half of all of the engineers and computer scientists. Now, I also believe that we can be looking at different schools. I think we can be looking at different technical subjects, for example. Clint doesn't have a CS degree. He does have an engineering degree. Can we have people from technical and STEM areas that can make the move into these fields? Absolutely. Are we doing enough of that? No.
But I would say, Reed, the goal is not to take the human element out. I think that would be a big mistake, and that's not what we try to do at ULU. Matter of fact, we try to take the human, when we're making decisions about companies like Aline's, and we're betting on what's going to happen 5 to 10 years in the future, any number we come up with is guaranteed to be wrong. All right, so now the question is, well, how wrong could you be? I mean, what kind of intuition can we build around this business? And we look to Aline and our entrepreneurs to have the intuition around the market opportunity. We bring benchmark data around dilution, exit multiples, the things that we do every day where we've got intuition around it. And then we essentially structure all that intuition in our framework and test it. And we say, where, if we're wrong, is it going to make a difference? And this is the surprising thing. 95% of the time, you can be way wrong about whatever number you put down, and it actually doesn't make a difference on whether we should invest or not. So 5% of the time it does, and the question is, which 5%? Which 5% of all those issues you might consider are the ones you want to focus on?
But how do you really take out that bias? I mean, if you're sitting in a room with somebody, you're reading, no matter what, like if you're reading their body language, you're looking them in the eyes, you're listening to the cadence of how they speak. This all, like, have you thought about just trying to make these decisions without even meeting with people? I mean, is that an idea?
Well, so I'd say, actually, meeting with them is really important in the sense that we still need to assess, well, do we think this person can go get that first customer? And, have that conversation be compelling in how they describe things. So we actually think the human element's really important. But you do make a good point. I mean, as soon as we're looking at somebody, my biases are going to show up, whether I like it or not. I mean, I'm going to do all this work to try de-bias myself, and I'm still biased. But that's where we have Miriam, and we've got Somik. So we've got a diverse team intentionally with the notion that the only way to overcome bias is to have diverse perspectives at the table. And so we're consciously also on the lookout for where, if we make an assessment, by the way, we'll put a probability on something, a chance we think this customer will make it, or this company will make it to the Series A level. And then, well, how many of them do? So we get actual data to support our assessments. By the way, just a plug here for Aline. So how many people are Series A investors out there? Show of hands. Oh, we got a few. So Aline, she doesn't want me to tell her entire numbers, but we invested a year ago. She had a healthy run rate then, 6x increase in revenue. She's about to go do her Series A funding. So go find her afterwards.
And she really does kind of hide the identity of people. And one of the things that they've seen is about 40% of these people would not have been hired when they go through the normal process. But when they go through an anonymous process, they're actually brought back for interviews. And when they're hired, they never exercise their money-back guarantee. So she is showing that we really do have these kind of biases. I think a lot of us are familiar with the one in music where even the sound of music sounds different if the gender is female versus male. But when you hide the violinist behind a curtain, it turns out the music sounds much better. The food tastes different if we don't know the chef is a woman. So it really does affect our abilities and our senses, and I think that's where we are learning that we can actually counter these effects on ourselves.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting parallels between what we do in interviewing IO and how you make decisions when you decide whom to invest in. And I think both involve front-loading what people can do and bringing some rigor to the process rather than just looking at how they look on paper. One of the craziest things actually is that a lot of our customers have rejected candidates at the resume screen that we've put in front of them when they had applied previously. And then when they go through an anonymous process and end up coming in through the back door, they get hired, which in turn causes a bit of an existential conversation among these companies as well.
Clint, you mentioned data. We talked about this before, that there really isn't much data when it comes to venture, right, on success rates. Like, what are the success rates, and how do you measure something that's so small? I mean, it's such a small percentage of companies that are funded that actually make it.
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges in being an investor, is that the numbers are so small that people's intuition just stops working. So there's a lot of cognitive psychology that says once something gets to be lower than 10%, it's just small. So there's not much difference between 1% and 10% in terms of how most people understand the world, but yet it's an order of magnitude difference. So if you look at Miriam's statistics she showed, 2.5% of venture investments turn into something financially interesting. So only 100 investments every year out of 4,000 really move the needle financially. And that's in a world where intuition stops working. And by the way, the other industries where this shows up, like pharma R&D and oil and gas exploration, these industries have found out that because it's so small and the intuition stops working, we need good process and we need good data. And in fact, the process that we use at ULU is actually best practice in both pharma R&D and oil and gas exploration for exactly this reason. But it hasn't moved its way into venture yet. And by the way, we're hoping to make that happen. If anybody's interested in learning more about this stuff, you can go to our website and you'll see a bunch of articles that we've written on how we apply this.
So doesn't it just come down to kind of gut instinct then? I mean, that's my takeaway, not to...
I've been through this process, so I can speak to that. I think that one of the ways that maybe VCs can manifest bias isn't just listening to the tone of my voice or looking at the fact that I'm a woman, but judging me on how I package my pitch, right? So if I'm not an experienced pitcher, which I wasn't really when I spoke to Clint and Miriam, I might not know which KPIs to focus on. And at the seed stage, you often don't have that much revenue, and you don't really have graphs that look like a hockey stick, right? So you have to figure out how to tell your story in a way that makes sense, that's well packaged, and that leads everybody to this inexorable conclusion that they have to give you money. So what Clint and Miriam's process did for us that I thought was amazing is they took the brunt off the packaging, and they looked under the hood and asked us the kinds of questions that helped us figure out what KPIs we should be focusing on when we pitch to other investors. And it took me being kind of an amateur pitcher, and took that off the table and made it about what our company has accomplished and achieved and where we're going, rather than how well I talk in front of a room.
So I don't know if there's any data on this, but I want to ask sort of a provocative question. I mean, I have no idea if this is true, but it just seems like you see women in the tech industry like Katrina Lake, who took her company public on a fraction of the funding that a lot of male investors have. Do women just do more with less compared to men in ventures? I mean, should we just be investing in female entrepreneurs? I mean, they seem to do very well.
I would say necessity is the mother of invention. So if you have less, you will do more with it. And I speak to that from a very personal experience. My family were migrant farm workers and factory workers. They had a high school education and less than an 8th grade education. I was a free lunch kid. I only spoke Spanish when I started Head Start. I made a lot with very little.
Does that ring true for you? Well, in our case, I guess I'm an immigrant, and we were on food stamps when I was growing up. But we've been doing all right for a while as a family. So I think in our case, it's more about the fact that hiring can be a very polarizing space for VCs, right? Because then they always wonder, is this a lifestyle business? Or are you just running a recruiting agency with some like little tech skin on the front, but you don't actually have this scalable product that's going to be $1 billion business? So when you're operating in a polarizing space that isn't like AI or Bitcoin or whatever is hot now, I think out of necessity, you have to be capital efficient because you don't know what's going to happen. And I think that's what forced us to do that. But it may be true that women-founded businesses don't always do AI and blockchain and might do things like hiring and solving other more practical, in my opinion, problems.
Do you want to weigh on this, Clint?
Well, I guess I think, this goes back to that pattern matching, which I think we would categorically reject. And if we look at actually some of the folks we funded this year, by the way, we're seed stage, and sometimes we invest Series A. It's the first money in typically. And we've invested in a couple of white guys. It was a $2.5 million pre-money valuation. And we invested in another team. It was a woman and man founder, $100 million pre-money valuation. And oh, by the way, they raised $50 million, and they were like 6x oversubscribed. So, I think it's a matter of, each individual case really needs to be evaluated in its own context.
So I think we have a little bit more time. I'm curious if there's kind of a chicken and egg thing in venture investing in startups where, do you need more diverse investors so that they can invest in more diverse companies, or is it vice versa, that you need more diverse people to be hired at the big companies like Facebook and Google in order to create the people with capital to start their own venture firms and eventually fund those companies?
Well, I'm a big believer that if you invest in diversity, those diverse people will continue to invest in diversity. So it pays dividends in the sense that, so I did very well at Google. I started Ulu, and you can see through our investing portfolio that has continued to invest in diverse people. Now, even though our numbers are all focused around our diversity numbers, we have 2/3 of our entrepreneurs are men, and about 60-something% are white. So I want to emphasize that, we're pretty reflective of the industry, but the industry is not reflective of the tech industry. We are actually reflecting what we see out there in the tech world, and I think that is where we're gaining the opportunity. Because we're not excluding others. And I do think that women will tend to invest more in women. And the reason this matters is that 39% of repeat entrepreneurs that are venture-backed have been a co-founder or a CEO in a previously venture-backed company. So we need to get them in the door, however it is, because we have diverse investors or because entrepreneurs themselves are becoming angels and investing in diverse people.
I think we're out of time, but thank you so much. It was really, really interesting.